The North Atlantic in winter has no mercy. Out there, the sea rises like walls of moving steel, waves 5 stories high, winds howling strong enough to tear at your skin, and icy spray freezing solid before it even hits the deck. Between 1940 and 1943, that gray, endless water became one of the most critical battlegrounds of World War II, not for territory, but for survival itself. Every convoy that crossed it kept Britain breathing. Here's the remarkable part. In that brutal ocean, British destroyers, smaller, lighter ships, held their ground against storms that sent larger German warships fleeing for shelter. Again and again, in weather that broke men and machines alike, it was the Royal Navy's lean, rugged destroyers that stayed on patrol, while the Kriegsmarine's powerful destroyers ran for the safety of their fjords. Take the night of February 17, 1943. A blinding gale northeast of Iceland. Force 9 winds. The British destroyer HMS Vanquisher held station through the chaos, tracking a German U-boat beneath the waves. Meanwhile, German Z-class destroyers, bigger, heavier, technically more advanced, had already turned tail toward Norway. And this wasn't an isolated story. Patrol reports from that winter repeat the same pattern. British ships stayed. German ships withdrew. This wasn't about bravery. Both sides had plenty of that. What decided the contest was design. Centuries of experience in Atlantic waters were built into every plate of British steel. These ships weren't comfortable. They weren't elegant. But they could take punishment and still fight back. On paper, German destroyers looked unbeatable. Taller hulls. More guns. Longer range. Designed by top engineers who understood the mathematics of the sea. Yet the reality was different. Each winter storm forced them into port. Their sleek design, made for the calmer Baltic and North Sea, simply couldn't handle the fury of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, British destroyers, some built before the war even began, kept hunting. They held sonar contact when the waves should have drowned it out. They chased U-boats through what meteorologists called survival weather. The difference came from generations of hard-earned lessons, from World War I's Western approaches to endless peacetime drills off Scotland's brutal northern coast. Germany's navy had prepared for a different kind of fight, short battles in enclosed waters. Britain's had been shaped by centuries of storms. That difference became a weapon. By 1943, the Atlantic itself was working for the Royal Navy. Every time the weather turned violent, the U-boats lost their support. German destroyers, vital for tracking convoys and coordinating wolf packs, vanished into safe harbors. And the smaller British escorts, the ships no one had expected to dominate, pressed on through the storm. In the end, it wasn't just courage that won the Atlantic. It was the wisdom of design. Ships built not for comfort, but for survival. Steel shaped by generations of sailors who knew one truth better than anyone. In the North Atlantic, the sea always gets the final vote. In the early 1930s, Germany's shipyards had barely begun to recover from the restrictions of Versailles. For nearly a decade, they couldn't build warships of any size worth mentioning. So when they finally returned to destroyer construction, technology leapt forward faster than strategy. In 1933, Admiral Raeder's team drafted plans for a new generation, the Type 1934 destroyers. On paper, they were fearsome, fast, heavily armed, and built to escort battleships across the North Sea and the Baltic. Those waters are rough, but limited. Waves rise quickly, crash hard, and fade just as fast. Swells rarely travel more than a few hundred miles. But the North Atlantic is a different beast altogether. Its waves roll unbroken for thousands of miles, building long, heavy motion that can lift and drop a ship like a toy. German designers prioritized speed and firepower over endurance. The Type 1934A destroyers could hit 38 knots, incredibly fast, and carried 5 main guns, outgunning their British rivals. To achieve that, they rode high above the waterline, with tall freeboards meant to keep the decks dry. That idea worked fine in the Baltic. In the open Atlantic, it backfired. The same high profile that looked elegant in calm seas became a lever for the wind to grab and twist. In heavy storms, these ships fought the sea itself, and lost. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, had spent 4 decades learning from failure. Their destroyer story began back in the 1890s, and every class since had been shaped by hard experience. Early river-class ships snapped their hulls in winter patrols. The tribals rolled dangerously in gales. But by the late years of the First World War, the British had figured it out. Their V and W-class destroyers, small, sturdy, and low in the water, could work with the Atlantic instead of against it. During the 1920s and 30s, that philosophy became doctrine. When the Admiralty wrote the design orders for the new A-class destroyers in 1927, they included a brutal demand. These ships must remain combat-ready in Force 8 conditions, winds over 40 knots and waves as tall as a two-story house. Not just survive that weather, fight in it. Every new class after that, B through I, took those lessons further. Winter trials off Scapa Flow were intentionally miserable. Ships were sent out in storms to find weaknesses before war could expose them for real. Geography dictated everything. Britain's survival depended on keeping Atlantic supply lines open, so its destroyers had to endure whatever the ocean threw at them. Germany's navy, on the other hand, was built for shorter-range operations close to home. When war came in 1939, that mismatch became painfully clear. Even the training culture reflected it. British destroyer captains had cut their teeth in the worst seas on Earth. They knew how far they could push a ship before it broke, and they shared that wisdom with the engineers who built the next generation. German commanders had trained in the Baltic, where rough weather meant ice sheets, not 50-foot waves. Their experience shaped designs that simply weren't made for the Atlantic. Neither navy was foolish. Both made perfect sense within their own world. But the Atlantic doesn't care about theory. It exposes every assumption, and by 1941, it had made its verdict clear. If you ever visit Liverpool and stand before the preserved bow of HMS Hesperus, you can see the difference in steel. The ship's nose doesn't rise sharply from the water like a spear. It curves down deep, its lower hull slicing through swells instead of bouncing off them. The flare of the upper bow keeps green water from burying the deck, the result of decades of trial, error, and pure stubborn survival. That shape, born of bitter experience and winter storms, became the reason Britain's destroyers could do what German ones could not: fight the sea and win. If you stand close enough to a British destroyer from the Second World War, you'll notice something subtle but vital: the curve of its bow. It doesn't rise straight from the sea. It sweeps outward, almost like the lip of a wave frozen in steel. That shape wasn't about looks. It was a survival mechanism. The Royal Navy spent decades trying to answer one brutal question. How do you keep a small, fast ship from being thrown backward or sideways when it meets a wall of water taller than its bridge? Earlier ships tried to face the waves head-on. Their bows were vertical, like knives meant to cut through the sea. But the Atlantic doesn't behave like the Baltic. When a 10-meter swell slams into a vertical bow, the water has nowhere to go but up and over. Tons of it crash onto the forward deck, driving the ship's nose down and threatening to pitch the whole vessel forward. Crews got injured, weapons were torn loose, and entire sections of the deck vanished under green water. British engineers decided to stop fighting the sea and start deflecting it. They built bows that flared outward at a 30 to 45-degree angle. When the wave hit, it no longer climbed aboard. It was thrown aside, splitting left and right. The ship still took spray, but the energy of the sea was redirected, away from the hull, away from danger. Beneath the surface, another secret weapon waited: the deep forefoot, the lower section of the bow that cut beneath the waterline. On ships like HMS Jervis, that forefoot reached nearly 2 meters below the loaded draft. When the destroyer met a 40-foot swell, the forefoot sliced into the lower part of the wave while the flared bow handled the top. The ship didn't smash into the sea, it divided it. That simple geometry meant everything. British destroyers could hold 18 to 20 knots through seas that would reduce other ships to a crawl. German destroyers, by contrast, had straighter bows and shallower forefeet, designs perfect for the short, sharp waves of the Baltic. In the Atlantic, those same hulls became airborne. Logs from ships like Z-31 describe terrifying moments when the entire bow lifted clear of the water, propellers screaming as they lost grip, before the ship slammed back down with bone-shaking force. Technically, they were seaworthy, but useless in combat. Meanwhile, British destroyers kept fighting. The Tribal-class ships, introduced in 1938, took the flared bow concept even further. During trials off the Hebrides in 1939, HMS Cossack maintained 22 knots through Force 9 conditions, winds nearing 50 knots, waves towering above 10 meters. The captain's report said it best: heavy weather working, but ship remains under full control, no loss of combat capability. That phrase, combat capability, was the point. Many ships could survive a storm by stopping and riding it out. British destroyers could fight through it. The bow flare also gave them a kind of built-in self-defense. When the ship plunged into a deep wave, the widening shape forward created a surge of buoyancy that pushed it back up before it could bury itself. That self-correcting motion let captains hold course in terrible weather, even while chasing submarines that tried to use the storm for cover. The Hunt-class escorts, for example, sat low in the water, so low they looked almost doomed. Their freeboard amidships was barely over 3 meters, compared to more than 4 on comparable German ships. Foreign naval officers who inspected HMS Brecon in 1941 couldn't believe such a wet design was intentional. But that low stance and sharp bow gave the ship an edge. It gripped the sea instead of fighting it. It could roll with the storm, not against it. And that's why, while other navies sought shelter, the Royal Navy's destroyers were still out there, cold, soaked, and very much on the hunt. When foreign observers first inspected HMS Brecon, they were skeptical. With her low deck and small profile, she looked like the sea would swallow her whole. Then they saw her in action, holding course through a force 8 gale off Iceland, and the doubts vanished. What seemed fragile on paper turned out nearly indestructible in practice. The secret was balance, literally. A lower deck meant a lower center of gravity, and that changed everything. In ship design, every ton of steel placed above the waterline raises the center of mass. The higher it sits, the more easily the wind and waves can tip a vessel over. German destroyers, tall and proud with their towering hulls and heavy superstructures, presented a huge target for the wind. In a 40-knot crosswind, ships like the Z-29 could lean 12 to 15 degrees before a single wave even hit them. British destroyers in the same conditions, smaller and closer to the water, tilted only about half that. It sounds like a minor detail, but in the chaos of battle, it meant the difference between a crew that could still man its weapons and one that was just hanging on for survival. The same physics applied to how the ships rolled. A key measure called metacentric height defines a ship's stability, how it responds when tilted. British destroyers had slightly higher values, around a meter or so, meaning they rolled more slowly and predictably. German ships, with their taller builds and higher centers of gravity, rolled fast and violently. That snappy motion made fire control nearly impossible. Guns couldn't stay on target. Sonar contact broke with every lurch. British destroyers weren't immune to the roll. Far from it. But their movement was steady enough that gunners could time their shots, and sonar operators could keep their bearings even in the heaviest seas. The difference showed itself again and again. On December 26, 1942, HMS Air found herself trapped in a North Atlantic storm with winds over 60 knots. Green water swept over her entire foredeck, yet she kept responding to the helm, battered, drenched, but under control. 3 weeks earlier, German destroyer Z-27 met a similar storm off Norway. Her captain reported that even with full rudder, the bow kept blowing 20 degrees off course. The wind got under her tall hull like a hand under a sail, twisting her sideways to the waves, a deadly position in that kind of sea. The British had accepted their trade-offs knowingly. Lower freeboards meant wetter decks. Crewmen worked constantly soaked to the skin. Salt water poured into spaces that stayed dry on German ships. Equipment rusted faster. Comfort was a luxury they simply gave up. The sailors joked that the V in V-class stood for very wet. But they also knew what mattered most. A wet ship that could fight was worth more than a dry one stuck in port. The results were impossible to ignore. By early 1943, Admiral Donat's own reports showed that British escorts were still hunting in weather his analysts had declared impossible for surface operations. The Atlantic had chosen its favorites. Even weapons placement reflected this practicality. On British destroyers, depth charge racks were mounted low and near the middle of the ship, where motion was minimal and handling remained safe. The Germans placed theirs higher and farther aft, fine in calm water, dangerous in a storm. That difference mattered during the infamous Arctic convoy JW-55B, 39 merchant ships hauling tanks, aircraft, and ammunition to Murmansk in December 1943. They sailed straight into one of the fiercest storms of the war. Winds screamed at 70 knots. Waves rose 50 feet high. The air temperature sat at 8 degrees below zero, and every splash froze solid the instant it landed. This was the Arctic Ocean at its most merciless, the kind of sea that could break steel. Somewhere out there, German U-boats were waiting. And holding the line on the convoy's port wing was HMS Obdurate, an O-class destroyer commanded by Lieutenant Commander Charles Slater. Ice thickened on her decks, her guns, her railings, adding tons of dead weight by the hour. Yet she stayed in formation. Because that's what these ships were built for. Not elegance, not comfort, survival, and the fight that came after it. By dawn, the Obdurate was a moving iceberg. Ice grew everywhere, along the forward gun, across the railings, clinging to the bridge windows. Crewmen worked in silence, swinging wooden mallets in rhythm, breaking off 30 kilos of ice every hour just to keep the ship balanced. Their breath froze in the air before it even left their mouths. Beneath the hull, the Aztec dome kept whispering through the storm, a miracle of persistence in water so violent that sonar signals should have dissolved into chaos. Yet at 8:20, the operator caught something. Bearing 287 degrees, range 1,400 yards. It could have been a whale. It could have been nothing. Or it could have been steel. Lieutenant Commander Slater ordered the turn. The Obdurate swung into the sea like a creature that had forgotten fear. Unknown to her crew, the German destroyers meant to shadow convoy JW-55B, Z-29, Z-33, Z-38, had already limped home. On Christmas morning, they'd been told to intercept. By the next dawn, they were crippled. Z-33's forward hull plating had cracked from repeated impacts. Z-29 lost her rangefinder to a single wave that hit with the weight of a falling wall. None of this reflected poor design. These were fine, modern ships, built at Germaniawerft and Deskamag to the highest peacetime standards. But the North Atlantic didn't respect standards. The Obdurate pressed on. Waves buried her forward deck under 3 meters of water every 90 seconds. Still, the Aztec trace sharpened, metallic echoes moving at 6 knots, 40 meters deep. A U-boat, trying to sneak ahead of the convoy under cover of a storm that should have blinded every surface ship. At 8:47, Obdurate dropped 5 depth charges, spaced at 150 and 250 feet. The blasts vanished instantly into spray and snow. A minute later, the Aztec screen bloomed with noise, a breakup, unmistakable, the hollow groan of hull plates tearing under pressure. U-601 was gone. 46 men went with her. The Obdurate's log said only, prosecuted contact to destruction. Weather heavy. Resumed station 0935. No mention of the impossible, of men holding course through 30-degree rolls, of precision timing while the ship shuddered like a struck bell. That same day, HMS Matchless and HMS Musketeer hunted 2 more submarines. Matchless forced U-716 down into a depth she could not survive. When she tried to surface again, British gunfire found her. All 3 destroyers recorded heavy weather, a phrase that, in their reports, never meant impossible. Across the sea, the Kriegsmarine's own war diary for December 26 told a different story. Destroyer patrol abandoned. Sea conditions prohibitive. Captured months later, a German analysis from February 1944 admitted confusion. How could British ships continue to fight in weather that rendered German vessels helpless? The answer was hidden deep in the design, in a choice made years earlier, in a boiler room. German destroyers carried high-pressure Wagner boilers, working at 70 kilograms per square centimeter. Marvels of engineering that could drive a 2,400-ton hull to 38 knots on calm water. But in the long violence of the Atlantic, that perfection turned fragile. Heavy rolling broke the delicate circulation inside the boiler tubes, creating hot spots that blistered and failed. And once the tubes began to fail, the engines had to be shut down or risk explosion. Z-20 Carl Gulster learned it the hard way. March 8, 1943, Mid-Atlantic, her speed falling as one boiler after another went cold. Powerless in a living sea. The ocean had chosen which ships it would allow to stay. In early 1942, the destroyer Z-20 Carl Gulster learned a hard truth northeast of Iceland. 6 hours into a Force 9 gale, the engineering team reported a sharp drop in steam pressure from the forward boiler room. When they opened it up, 3 boiler tubes had ruptured. The crew shut down the forward plant and limped on a single boiler, barely managing 8 knots, not nearly enough to hold position against 10-meter seas. For the next 11 hours, Z-20 was at the mercy of the ocean, rolling beam on to the waves until the storm finally eased. The cause lay deep in design philosophy. German destroyers used high-pressure Wagner boilers, engineering marvels that could deliver immense power and speed in calm seas. But that power came at a price. The delicate tubing and extreme temperatures simply couldn't endure the chaos of the North Atlantic. When the ship rolled or slammed into a wave, water circulation broke down, hot spots formed, and tubes burst like glass under strain. The British took a different path. Their destroyers used simpler, lower-pressure Admiralty 3-drum boilers, running at just 21 kilograms per square centimeter. On paper, they looked outdated and inefficient. In practice, they were nearly indestructible. They tolerated vibration, flexing, and sudden shocks without complaint. Exactly what you needed when every storm felt like a bombardment from the sea itself. But the real difference didn't end in the engine rooms. It was written into the bones of the ships. German hulls were built using longitudinal framing, lighter and elegant, ideal for speed and calm waters. Yet it focused stress along long, continuous beams. Each time the bow hit a wall of water, the hull twisted slightly, sending that force down the entire length of the ship. With time, the metal itself began to fatigue. British destroyers used transverse framing, heavier, less efficient, but immensely stronger. Each frame acted like a rib, sharing the punishment evenly. It wasn't graceful engineering, but it survived the Atlantic's cruelty. By 1942 and 1943, the results were visible. German destroyers returned home scarred and cracked, Z-25 showing fractures near frame 38, Z-31 suffering damage along her keel that grew worse with every repair. Meanwhile, British ships came back battered but intact. Their heavier skeletons held together when the German hulls began to split apart. And then came the matter of top weight, the silent killer of many fine designs. German destroyers carried an impressive arsenal, 5 12.7-centimeter guns, fire control towers, and heavy torpedo mounts high above the deck. That gave them cruiser-level firepower, but it also raised their center of gravity dangerously. In calm seas, it meant stability. In the North Atlantic, it meant chaos. During Operation Front Theater in 1943, destroyer Z-29 rolled through arcs of 40-plus degrees, so violently that men and machinery were thrown across compartments. No crew can fight like that. British ships were armed more modestly, 4 4.7-inch guns, all mounted lower. They gave up a bit of firepower, about 8 kilograms per salvo, but gained something far more valuable, balance. Their lighter top weight and broader beams made them predictable, even in monstrous seas. And that stability became the weapon that turned the tide in the North Atlantic. By 1942, the stretch of open ocean between Greenland and Ireland was known by one grim name, the Black Pit. It was 600 miles of deadly silence, beyond the reach of any land-based aircraft. German U-boats ruled there, hunting convoys in wolf packs, surfacing freely to coordinate attacks by radio. It was a slaughter zone. Early in 1942, each convoy crossing that gap lost, on average, more than 4 merchant ships to submarine attacks. But by late 1943, that number had fallen to less than 1. Long-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator helped close the air gap, yes, but aircraft didn't keep convoys alive in storms. Destroyers did. And the reason those destroyers could keep fighting when every German escort had turned for port was simple. They were built for the ocean, not for elegance. In the end, the British didn't win because their ships were faster, prettier, or newer. They won because their ships refused to break. What ultimately broke the back of the German wolf packs wasn't a secret weapon or a single battle. It was the Royal Navy's sheer refusal to stop fighting, no matter how vicious the weather became. By 1943, the Atlantic had turned into a proving ground for both machines and men. When the storms came, and they always came, German destroyers would retreat to port, their hulls twisting and their boilers protesting. But British escorts stayed out. Even in 70-knot winds and 12-meter seas, they kept their stations, still hunting. German intelligence reports from that period make the frustration plain. Again and again, commanders complained that British destroyers simply ignored the weather. While German surface ships lay pinned in their fjords, British escorts were still chasing sonar contacts through hurricane-level seas. The old trick of using a storm to hide, a tactic that had saved countless U-boats, was suddenly useless. One incident in May 1943 made the point painfully clear. South of Iceland, HMS Hesperus, not Hesperus, locked onto U-223 in the middle of a Force 9 gale. The submarine tried to dive, confident the rough water would mask its escape. It didn't work. The destroyer's Aztec held contact through waves tall enough to bury her bow, and a few minutes later, depth charges tore the U-boat apart. Its commander, Captain Lieutenant Peter Gerlach, had survived 2 similar chases before, both in heavy weather. This time, the ocean offered no protection. Admiral Donitz saw the pattern forming in his daily war logs. His notes from late 1943 are edged with exasperation. Enemy escorts maintain operations in weather conditions impossible for our own. What he was witnessing wasn't luck, it was the outcome of decades of design experience. The Royal Navy had built ships meant to fight the Atlantic itself. The numbers tell their own story. In early 1943, British destroyers in the western approaches averaged over 24 days at sea each month. Their German counterparts managed barely half that. The reason wasn't fuel or manpower, it was weather. British hulls could ride out seas that forced the Kriegsmarine back to harbor. And that gap in endurance shattered the Wolfpack system. The U-boats depended on coordination, one sub spotting a convoy, others racing in from hundreds of miles away. That network needed steady surface support, weather reports, radio relays, even destroyers to shadow and mark targets. When the storms came, that chain collapsed. British escorts stayed with the convoys. The U-boats were left blind and alone beneath the waves. By May 1943, the tide had fully turned. 41 submarines were lost in a single month, a slaughter the Germans would forever call Black May. Historians tend to credit the victory to codebreakers, radar, or long-range aircraft, and those mattered. But behind the headlines was quiet brilliance. The engineers who had drawn those flared bows and deep forefoots years earlier, long before war came. Their understanding of how a ship should meet a wave, how it should flex, recover, and keep fighting, was as decisive as any weapon. The Royal Navy didn't just win the Battle of the Atlantic by outthinking the enemy. They won it by outlasting the sea itself. By the time the Second World War began, the Royal Navy carried with it a memory carved from centuries of hardship at sea. Each ship lost to storm or design flaw had added another line to that hard-earned textbook. And by 1939, those lessons were no longer just words in a report, they were built into the steel itself. The shape of the bow, the balance of the hull, even the placement of a depth charge rack told the story of a navy that had learned, through pain, what it truly meant to fight the Atlantic. Germany's path had been different from the start. After Versailles, their navy grew under restrictions, confined to the Baltic and the North Sea. Those waters shaped their thinking: short missions, controlled weather, and limited horizons. Their destroyers were fast, heavily armed, and superbly engineered for the seas they knew. But when Hitler's ambitions outgrew the Baltic, the Kriegsmarine found itself in a new ocean, one that didn't forgive design choices. It wasn't a failure of courage or skill. The men aboard the German Z-class destroyers were every bit as brave as their British counterparts. Their ships just weren't built for what the Atlantic demanded. When storms rolled across thousands of miles of open water, those tall, narrow hulls became liabilities. Machinery failed, superstructures buckled, and the crews, soaked, battered, exhausted, were forced to turn back. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy's destroyers kept going. Through gales, sleet, and seas that could swallow a battleship whole, they stayed on the line, escorting convoys, rescuing survivors, chasing submarines that believed the weather would protect them. Every ship that stayed operational through a storm meant a convoy that lived to see another dawn. By 1944, the results were undeniable. The U-boats were dying faster than Germany could replace them. Convoy losses had dropped to the point where Britain's supply lifeline was secure. The North Atlantic, vast, merciless, and once dominated by the Wolfpacks, now belonged to the destroyers that refused to go home. And when the war ended, the lessons didn't fade. Naval architects around the world took note. The flared bows, the low centers of gravity, the emphasis on stability over speed, these ideas became the blueprint for generations of ships built to face the worst seas on Earth. Even today, designers working on polar research vessels and Arctic patrol ships trace their principles back to those wartime destroyers. The North Atlantic was a ruthless teacher. It punished arrogance, exposed shortcuts, and rewarded only those who respected its power. In the end, it wasn't just a battlefield, it was a classroom. And the navies that survived weren't the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones that listened to the sea and built accordingly.